Welcome to the Future of Sharing, the series where we're looking in depth at how can we make the sharing economy work for everyone. I'm Pete Leiden, I'm the founder of Reinvent, and today we've got a visitor coming in from, not Berlin, from Germany, Stuttgart, but it's Tim Leberecht, who is a long time kind of marketing visionary is one way to think about you. I got to know him when he was at Frog Design, the chief marketing officer at the time there, for a long stint here in San Francisco. But he's also the author of the book, The Business Romantic, Give Everything, Quantify Nothing, and Create Something Greater Than Yourself. It's a book that he's been speaking on for a while. He's done TED Talks, he's been a frequent speaker, he's written in all kinds of different publications, and he's got his own firm now based out of Berlin, although he travels all the time, in which he's basically helping folks to really rethink big thinking on how to revamp and transform your businesses. So great to have you here.
Great
Thanks.
to be here, Peter. Yeah, great to be reconnected.
It is good to see you.
Yeah.
Well, here's where one of the things that's in this series, we're trying to get people all over the world actually thinking about different aspects, bringing their thinking into relevance, let's say, to exploring deeper the sharing economy in the broadest sense. And what I was kind of when I thought about you, I thought about your book, The Business Romantic. And for those who don't know it, could you give us a little sense of what you mean by the business romantic and kind of some of the thinking that comes off there, and we'll kind of roll with that.
Yeah, I wrote the book 2 years ago, and it was really meant to be a counterpoint, I think, to our obsession with the quantification and datafication of everything, basically upholding the idea of a romantic way of living. So I'm not talking about romance in the popular sense in terms of Valentine's Day or, any things that HR departments need to be worried about, but more romantic in a sense of romanticism, the romantic movement from 200 years ago. And the reason I think we need this is that I believe we're in at a new point of disenchantment, very much like the Romantics were 200 years ago when they were revolting against the Enlightenment. And I think now we're basically so obsessed with data and confuse data with the one objective truth that we have narrowed our version of being human and really kind of, in a very reductionist way. So the book is trying to basically expand the playing field again and re-enchant that domain where we spend most of our waking hours, which is the workplace. And I think the connection to the sharing economy, thinking about this, is interesting because I think the sharing economy too is in a stage of disenchantment, of disillusion, and I think it needs a lot of re-enchantment because it's here to stay. And that's a really interesting question, I think, and you alluded to it in your intro. How can we re-enchant, or how can we make the sharing economy romantic?
Before we get in, because I'd love to lead you into that, and we got plenty of time here to talk about it. So you kind of, when you were coming out with that book, it was really the big data, the quantified self, the kind of business measurements, it's metrics, productivity, efficiency. That was kind of, in many respects, what you're pushing at. Were you talking about kind of the coming of AI and, because there's even more kind of worry, essentially, with other kind of things on the horizon here. But to talk a little bit about both the current kind of state of play and a little bit of where you think it's going in terms of the business environment.
Yeah,
In terms of general business, and not what you're promoting, but essentially, what are you up against? Basically, is what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, 2 years ago, as you rightly said, it was mostly disenchantment caused by the quantified self movement and this obsession with metrics and KPIs, and I think now there are forces that are much more sort of fierce, right, and significant, namely AI, which is not just threatening, I think, our romantic selves in a sense, or sort of the way we express ourselves at work, but essentially, in a dystopian, if you want to be dystopian about it, at least threatening a very human agency. And I think that's also why we're probably, I think, I have more access now, and corporations are more open. I mean, 2 years ago, they were sort of listening to me like, okay, romance, that seems really like far-fetched and a little strange and obscure. And now I think what has happened over the past 2 years is because of AI and automation is that I think a lot of organizations just are very, insecure about the future, right? And feel like, okay, sort of realizing what is at stake and are looking for new ways to maintain, human cultures, or keep the human in the mix. So, I mean, we need to. I think we're in a major time of transition. It's a painful time of transition, and we need to. Where sort of the old system and old paradigms, I think, have sort of run out of course, are losing their relevance, and we need to reinvent. No pun intended, but we need to reinvent, I think, our systems and what it means to be human. And I think my belief is we need to really radically insist on still taking place, the human in our communities, in our societies, in our economies. Because if we don't do that very fervently, very radically, then I think there is a real danger that we're going to be designed out of the equation because of AI.
Hmm. Now, so you've talked about the reception of, let's say, your book. So you've done a bunch of talks on this. I know you've been writing a lot about it. So you're finding increasing interest in kind of the strain that you're bringing out here a little bit more.
Yeah.
Say a little bit more about that. Just kind of what's been happening the last couple of years for you.
Well, I think, I was very much an outlier. So I was chief marketing officer at Frog at the time. It was 2000, when I wrote the book, it was 2013, 14, 2015, it came out. And Frog was owned by KKR, a big private equity firm, and I was working with the board very closely. And so I experienced this bottom line thinking and this very brutal, ruthless investor logic, very closely. I think that was sort of the catalyst for me to write the book. And I think in the beginning there was a little bit of because of the term romance, I think people confused it with love what you do what you love, which to me always felt like way too sort of narrow. Romance is much more dangerous than that. I think what romance means is to bring not just your positive emotions to work and happiness, and then measuring that, but actually really bringing your full selves to work, including negative emotions, grief, anger, the dark side of our being human as well. And I think if we make space for that, then I think ultimately we'll have a higher chance of being human at work. I remember that I was at IBM, for example, or I spoke at UPS. So very engineering minded, very engineering driven organizations. And they were quite confused when they first heard me speak about romance and these, probably somewhat fuzzy ideas, right, in terms of sort of strict business logic. But I think what's happening now is just, I think that at least organizations that are still interested in serving humans and having humans in the mix, as part of their value chain, they realize that that efficiency alone, which has been the main paradigm, I think, of digital technology over the past decade or so, is just not sufficient. You need to invest in cultures. We need to invest in rituals. We need to invest in intimacy, in emotions, in relationships, and all those things that make being alive, intriguing and meaningful. And if we don't do that very deliberately at work, and we only sort of follow the paradigm of efficiency, I think there is a good chance that we're just no longer needed, because I think the one thing we bring to the table is not being efficient, is being creative, is being generous, is being warm and fuzzy and in a sense unpredictable. So I think that's sort of the truth that I'm insisting on, and that I feel is resonating more and more with organizations than 2 years ago.
Now, before we kind of push on that a little bit, because like you mentioned UPS and IBM kind of bouncing off it, give us a little bit more context, the historical context of when you talk about romance. So you're thinking like German romantic, kind of mid-19th century. I mean, coming off the Enlightenment. Talk a little bit more about that. To me, it's fascinating kind of analogy, but it's not something that people commonly think about. So let's get that foundation understood a little bit better. So maybe even describe that kind of romantic movement, and maybe some parallels to what you're seeing today. It'd be interesting.
Well, the Romantic movement started in the late 18th, early 19th century. There was a seminal meeting at a Swiss lake, Lake Geneva. The Shalleys were there, Lord Byron, other sort of famous British romantics, and of course there's sort of a German streak, Novalis, Eichendorff, Schlegel, God. I kind of hated them actually when I went to school. I found them really like boring and just too sort of thick. But then when I started looking at meaning and work and data, I realized, oh wow, we're at a very similar point. This is kind of interesting that we're fighting, in a similar setting against very similar forces back then. Back then, it was basically the Enlightenment. It was the idea that we could reduce all life to something empirical, right? To practical reason, and to rationality. And of course, that came with a lot of benefits. I'm not disputing that, but it was a bit reductionist for the romantics, and they felt like, no, 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 we're human because we're subjective. We have emotions. We are erratic. We are inconsistent. Inconsistency is a human right. Let's make sure that we fight for that. And so they basically espoused other virtues in response to that, what they called a disenchantment. And I think the parallel is that now we're at a similar moment where we're again, I think, sort of surrendering, I guess, to this reductionist view of ourselves, right? So with efficiency and self-optimization based on quantification being sort of the key principles, it seems, of many social interactions. And I mean, it's that, right? The quantified self movement, and there's all kinds of aberrations where the idea of quantifying and optimizing our behavior is really infiltrating very intimate private aspects of our lives, right? Sort of whether that's relationships, or we always want to be better and more optimized in what we do. And I think that that's one major force of disenchantment. I think the other one is just that, and that brings us to the sharing economy, is that I think, there's a question whether the sharing economy is sort of just another stepping stone to the ultimate triumph of the market society, basically economic principles commodifying pretty much everything, right? Not just sort of products and services we provide, utilitarian goods, but really sort of emotional labor, and really sort of the core of what makes us human. I think that's sort of the big concern with the sharing economy. And I think also a major reason of disenchantment, on a broader economic level, is just like this cynicism, right? I mean, and look at the president that we got, right? I mean, in a way, he's the escalation of the market society, right? It's a government that considers everything a deal, like a transaction, right? And I think very much at the expense of what traditionalists would call morale. And or solidarity, right, with those who are vulnerable. And I think if we just really follow this economic transactionalist idea of a market society, then that's not a civilization I want to live in, and that's probably not going to be very civilized to begin with. So I think that those are sort of the big questions, I think, right now. And for me, sorry, this is a long answer, but for me, the epiphany was that there's actually, rather than making everything up from scratch, there's actually a lot to learn from history and how the romantics embodied this sort of fuller version of themselves and insisted on subjective truth and not just a data-driven objective truth that was based on empirical reason.
Was there a kind of a reaction against technology in that strain? Was there kind of the Luddite kind of reaction, or was it actually comfortable enough with technology, and it was actually just trying to re-emphasize human qualities at the time?
I think it was less sort of Luddites and anti-technology. It was maybe a little bit too early for that. No, I think it had more to do with sort of the regime of rationality and this sort of the dictate of rationality, I think. And I think for the romantics, and by the way, that's true for my idea of business romance as well. It's not anti-technology, right? I mean, data is great and technology is great. It's magical. I think the question is just to what end and how are we going to use it? Are we going to use it mainly to increase efficiency and to scale growth, or are we going to use it to pursue a way of life and an idea of our societies that is not just based on transactions and sort of market mechanisms, but is actually also giving us a broader playing field for our romantic selves? And I think there's, look at virtual reality or AR. I mean, there's a lot of technology out there, AI as well. I think that can be used to that purpose, actually allowing us to have, to commute between different worlds, a very romantic feature. To have multiple identities and switch between them is also a very romantic idea, right? The idea of having variety and inconsistency. So in that regard, I think there's a lot of technology that could be used in a romantic way, and I find that really very intriguing. So it's more a question of the mindset and how we use it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, just trying to clarify that. So talk about this, when you talk about the sharing economy, because there's one of the things over the course of all these interviews we found is there's kind of a shifting definition of what is a sharing economy. So when you talk about the sharing economy, it seems you're also talking about the the broader, sometimes the gig economy, kind of contractual relations, all these things. But you tell me. I mean, when you hear the word sharing economy, how do you think about that? And when as we're discussing this.
Yeah, that's a good question. So when you asked me to be on this program, I was thinking like sharing economy. It's actually not a term that I like or that I ever. I mean, I just used it because you introduced it. But I think sharing for me is a quintessential human activity, but to me, that's very much defined by intrinsic motivation and generosity. So you can share when you're part of a family, you give, but not expecting a monetary or an economic reward immediately. So that's why I find the term sharing. I mean, the sharing economy at this point, or what people call the sharing economy, is still a marketplace. It's still a transaction, right? You're either selling access capacity or you're selling your time, basically. So I find that the concept of gig economy or peer-to-peer or platform economy, in a sense, much more honest. And from a sort of participant viewpoint, gig economy probably describes it best. I mean, there's some parallels. The term gig comes from the culture of jazz, right? And there are some parallels there because it's very much a sporadic, ad hoc way of making a living, right? And also, I think as you know, the gig economy has come under a lot of criticism because of drug addiction and the Fiverr ad, people working themselves to death, and platform providers glorifying that. So I find that analogy to the culture of jazz interesting, and also with regards to the future of work. Because we're probably going to see more, whether we like it or not, we're going to see more sort of a fragmentation of the workforce. And yeah, more. I mean, the gig economy is here to stay. There are going to be more gigs, more micropreneurs, more independent contractors, and all of that. But so sharing economy, I don't like. I think gig economy or platform economy describes it better and sort of more accurately.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Say more about this relationship to the jazz situation, because I had not really heard that explored the way you touched on it. So, what is the roots of that? You're saying literary gig is basically
Well,
you're
it's a
doing a music
term,
gig?
right, that you use that I think musicians still use it, right? So I played in a band myself,
I see what you're
especially if
saying.
it's sort of not a, you have, I mean, especially if you change formations, you speak of gigs, right? I did a gig there, I did a gig there, different band, different audience. And as a way of making a living by basically performing, every night, often very late, right, to sort of rough hours, I guess, but being dependent. I mean, what it also describes, I think, is that you're very directly dependent on market demand, right? That's sort of the jazz musicians' fate, right? So you're very much dependent on your performance is directly valued, right? There's demand for it one night, there is demand, there's enough people there. The next night, there's only 5 people there. And there's also not a lot of security, of course. There's not a lot of job stability or any sort of regular income in that sense, right? So it's very sporadic, it's very atomized, but I don't want to sound sort of too dark on it. I think that the upside is for the right people is that you have a lot of autonomy, you have a lot of variety, you get to play with a lot of different people. There's some romance in there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you get to be creative and you live a portfolio life, right? And I think that going forward, that's an interesting analogy. I think we'll probably be more like artists, right? And we have to be able to improvise, to learn skills, to forget skills, to forge relationships like a jazz band does, right? To sort of just go with the flow and then play a different instrument or have a different rhythm, right? I think that's going to be very much what the future job market is demanding from us, and so that's why I like it, and I think that's why the gig economy is also a good, I think is a good paradigm and platform for work in the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Well, actually, funny enough, we're actually have another project on the future work in which it's really focused on these independent workers, because there's no question those ranks are burgeoning. It's almost certainly moving in that direction. And it's an interesting thing I've been kind of wrestling with which is kind of a reframe of it a little bit. It's been kind of seen as on the margins of the real economy or the kind of core jobs economy. But if you really rethink it, you could think, well, it could also be the advance or the beginning of essentially what will be the dominant economy
Mm.
going forward. And and that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing if you redevise systems around that
That's right.
and kind of understood that that's the nature of work in a way. Because I think there is a lot of upsides. I mean, it's clearly, in fact, even the polling bears this out. A lot of people in those economies actually like it and don't really want to, get a 9 to 5 job and work, and in fact, there's tons of polling that shows, a lot of people hate their jobs. We kind of glorify these
Mhm.
static jobs, these 20th century versions of jobs, and don't. So it's a weird time. I think it's in between these two systems. Like the system isn't really working fully for the gig
Right.
thing,
Mhm.
but or the sharing economy for that matter, which is I think of as a kind of subset of that. But so we got this kind of messy situation where neither of them are kind of working right, and we're trying to figure it out. I don't know. Do you share kind of a general view
I
like
share
that? Or?
that. I share that view, and I also share the view that this is a precursor. I do believe that the gig economy is going to be probably, or if not the dominant way of working in the future. So I think we're very much in a transition, and I think you're right. I mean, right now there's a lot of tension. I mean, there's a lot of data that says, yeah, many gig economy workers are happy and happier than they were in their traditional corporate environments. But there's also a lot of research, right, that says a lot of people. I mean, also applying a global perspective. If you're sort of a software developer in Nigeria, right, and you depend on a platform to make a living, that there is, I think, warranted concern over a race to the bottom and a very competitive marketplace that's just going to play out now in a space that is just not regulated or as protected than as a, maybe admittedly boring job might have been in a corporate environment, right? But I think you're right on. I think we're in a transition and we need to devise new systems. I don't think we can apply the traditional employment models to the gig economy, right? But there's some interesting, I was just reading for example, the Royal Society of Arts and Manufacturing in the UK, I think also in the US, they're developing they call it, I think, shared regulation or a charter for good work in the gig economy, which I think is an attempt to do just that, to create a multi-stakeholder governance model that is more flexible and dynamic, compared to traditional employment models. So I think there's a lot of attempts right now to craft these systems, and I think that's really what we need to do, because otherwise I think it might be a bit archaic and sort of with an eroding social contract at the core, which is I don't think where we want to be.
So whether it's the sharing economy, when I kind of think of the sharing economy, I think there is a gig economy, like the platform worker in Nigeria doing coding or something. At least the way I would see it, it wouldn't be really the sharing economy. There's a kind of a broader gig or contract or freelance economy that I think that would no doubt that'd be part of. But there is that aspect of the sharing that there's some piece of property or something that you have that you're getting more use out of and sharing. And granted, there's tension over whether it's really sharing. But the thing is, I have a house or I got a cabin. I want to share that with other people and make money on it. Or I have an extra room. I want to share it, yeah, and make money. But I will, or I got a car that I need to make, but I'll share it by driving people around and talk to people. One piece of that that's interesting about that, though, which is one of the reasons I thought I'd talk to you, is it does involve other humans, and you're actually connecting people. And they're kind of jobs that I guess you could say, set aside the Uber driver for now, because that might get robotized. But in many respects, these jobs are human, because one of the things that makes them work is face-to-face interaction. So I have my tools, and I want to I'll help someone do tools, or there's people now having food kind of sharing. Someone makes a bunch of food and the neighborhood kind of does it. And there's also kind of things going on with, just by the way, it's not commercial. There's even kind of non-profity ways, and actually Europe has a lot of these kind of more non-commercial ways. So anyhow, I just want to talk, when you see that dimension of it, the human side of things, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I find that really fascinating. I write about it in my book, The Business Romantic, that there is this great romantic or human potential in the sharing economy in particular. The way you just defined it as a subset of the gig economy, and it does create the serendipity often that was lacking in a more traditional, in a traditional marketplace in a corporate environment. So, whether that is the conversation with the Uber driver, right? A lot of people say they have much more engagement with the Uber drivers. They're much more sort of incentivized or inclined, just genuinely inclined to have a conversation with their guests. I think Airbnb, in particular, I find really interesting. I always, in my talks, I sort of celebrate them as the example of a company that is smart and data driven, but also, I think, quintessentially romantic, because at the core of their value proposition is actually a romantic promise, which is to peek into the lives of strangers, right? To not know what's going to happen. It's this mystery of stepping into another life and actually having this sort of interesting facilitated intimacy, right? You kind of like get to know somebody by staying in their apartment for 2 or 3, 4 days, actually very much so. And also the trust, right, that's being facilitated by Airbnb in the process. So, and I do see that, and I think you could argue that the sharing economy creates actually a lot of social capital, right? And I think it's going to be one of these fascinating questions is just what are they going to do with it, right? Because right now,
who, what do you say they? Well, who
the
is they?
platform providers, right, but also the participants and assistants. But I think mainly the platform providers such as Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, and others, because I think that the trust that has been sort of deposited into that system is, in a sense, right, it's been sort of shared with the other participants and used as a currency, but it's also just a deposit, right? So all that social capital that's there that a platform like Airbnb built by having these connections between all these sub communities and communities. I think the question is like, what are they going to do with it? Ultimately, to what end can they use it? I love that Airbnb has begun to create these experiences, right? You can buy, Kafka in Prague, right, or sort of these extended versions of trips, which I think is great. There are also services such as With Locals, where a local tour guide, walks people through his hometown and shares his or her, favorite restaurant and so forth. So there's an experiential side to it as well. So I see that potential, and I think that's great. I think the the caveat is I think there is a bit of a perversion going on, of course, and there is frustration, I think, with from many many participants, that they feel like, okay, but there are some quasi monopolies, the big juggernauts, Uber and others, come in and they just so monopolized it and so commercialized it, and of course also by referring to Uber now in particular, by their behavior and the sort of bullyish behavior and all the scandals they had, right, kind of like undermined this very promise of the sharing economy, which was to restore reciprocity and an idea of an economy that is not just transactional, right? That restores community and human interaction. I think that was the initial promise of the sharing economy, why there was so much traction around it. And I think we're at a point now where there's a lot of, it's normal. There's a lot of disillusionment. It's like, oh well, maybe it's just another form of capitalism. Now actually we're being, we humans we're being the assets, and a very house, is the asset. That's the negative sort of view. But I think we're sort of in this interesting dichotomy right now. We got to untangle it and find a way out to, re-inject some romance and some humanity back into the sharing economy.
So if I'm hearing you right, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're saying it's not commercialization per se that that person given the Kafka tour in their hometown proudly, and those visitors, instead of sitting on some giant tour bus, connect with this human and make a friend in this city and get to know that city in an intimate way. That's a positive thing, but the fact that it's enabled through a transaction is not necessarily a bad thing for you. It's just how it's handled. Is that correct to say? Or tell me a little bit more about the balance between the commercials, because when you first talked, it kind of made me think any commercial transaction would sour that relationship, or is it possible to have some commercial transaction that still respects the romantic or kind of human to human kind of experience and just makes it happen in a way that, if there was no money changed hands, there wouldn't have been enough incentive to pull that off or something.
Well, that's the very premise of my book, right? So I'm not a romantic, I'm a business romantic. I'm here to prove
All right, there we go. Sorry.
Yeah, you can do commerce, and commerce is an enabler of romance. I very much believe so. And I think commerce traditionally, of course, has been all about human interaction and crafting, facilitating relationships. There's a great quote by Robert Solomon, an economist, philosopher, who said, I'm not quoting him verbatim, but basically that marketplaces are not, basically they're not designed for transactions. Let's not forget that marketplaces are first and foremost, there are forums for, social communities and human interaction. They're wonderful mechanisms for that, right? And I think that's very much the idea of the sharing economy. So no, I don't think that they're at odds, commerce and human warmth and intimacy. But I think what is important is the way you do it, how you do it, and if your aura is not existent, or if it's only about a very sort of brutal efficiency-driven way of transacting, then I think users will, or customers will notice that. I think Airbnb is doing a good job. I think Lyft's doing a good job. Creating a culture and a certain experience, and also speaking with a human voice, and creating enough features as part of the system that are not just about transaction or the bottom line, at least not seemingly so. And I think that's probably all that it takes. It takes sort of a human voice, a kind relationship to the customer, and an experiential, definition of sort of how you interact. I think that's what it takes. Ultimately, I think all these organizations have to decide between efficiency and creating a brand that is based on community and culture. And culture, by its very definition, is always the opposite of efficiency, right? I mean, culture is a waste, quite literally. And Kevin Kelly spoke very eloquently about this, saying, waste is something we humans are very good at. That's the very core of creativity and innovation. And I think that is the beauty of or can be the beauty of some of these sharing economy platforms, where there's a collateral product, right? So if there's a derivative that might not even be intended, but there is some kind of human capital or human connection made that doesn't even have to be quantified, right? But that is just sort of a nice little side product. And as long as these platforms allow for that, I think customers will forgive, the fact that they're at the core, sort of commercial mechanisms, marketplaces. I think that's okay.
Well, when you said we have to untangle this situation or tease it out, I mean, a lot of, what we're talking about is the future sharing. So we're not saying, we're kind of trying to understand how would a system work for everyone. I mean, that's literally the theme of what we're trying to figure out. So given your work, your book, your experience in this space, like what kind of advice, I mean, you gave a little bit of it there just already, but how would you start to untangle this? I mean, what would you advise the companies themselves, or potentially cities that are regulating these spaces, or any thoughts about a kind of principles or ways to think about this, or even magnanimous gestures that would actually help things, make things better? Any structural ideas like that? I'm just curious.
Well, I think one thing is certain, right? That the amount of economic anxiety and instability, and maybe a growing social divide, the haves and the have-nots, and that's going to increase very likely, through automation, which is a real concern. And I have not heard a better idea to address that at the sort of the lower levels of the Maslow pyramid, right? The basic needs and the macroeconomic view, than universal basic income. So I think that is a great policy idea. There are some ideas that call, some concepts calling universal education income, basically a stipend from a state government that gives every worker a regular, warranted, guaranteed income to either just take care of the basic needs, or invest part of it, right, in continuous education, which we will need in the future job market, in the gig economy, probably more so than elsewhere. So I think that to me is like advice number one. And I think there is a lot of traction, interestingly, in Europe and the US, right? Even bipartisan, I think, support to some extent for this idea. And I think that's the very base for all future action, to be honest, because otherwise I think we'll have so much anxiety and so much volatility in the system that I just can't see how large parts of the population will be able to thrive in whatever economy we design. And I think, secondly, I think I would say that so many of the features of the gig economy, sort of micro tasks, right? The freedom and autonomy to pick your work, be more selective, maybe be more purpose driven, have sort of small micro interactions with other human beings, is really great. And I think what I'm seeing is that there are companies already, traditional companies, actually adopting some of these features and incorporating them into their work environment. So Cisco, for example, has I think they call it a purpose mobility platform, essentially offering employees to pick certain projects, stay on them for 4 weeks, and then change roles, in a very sort of high fluctuation. So basically creating, in a sense, like a little bit of a gig economy or a gig economy inside their organizations. And I think that's really interesting, I think, to give more credence to the gig economy and kind of bring it back or weave it together with the traditional economy or traditional corporate environment. So I think that will also help, I think, gain more trust and more traction. And then I think thirdly, at the individual level, we need to think about, of course, what ultimately, I mean, first of all, I think we have to liberate ourselves from the dictate of the quantified self, as I mentioned earlier. I think we have to give ourselves the permission to be romantic selves, right? If we have basic income and if we work in organizations or in economies that allow us to do that. But I think the really interesting question is, I think for ourselves is, I mean, ultimately, I think the greatest asset is for us human beings, of course, is our identity, right? Is sort of who we are, our reputation, but also really like our brain, our soul, our spirit, what we provide, what we give to the world. And I think it's very interesting to think about this in light of AI. Ultimately, what are the ultimate assets worth sharing that we have, right? I mean, probably no longer, our time in the car, maybe no longer, TaskRabbit deliveries, because as you said earlier, they might be automated. So what is it eventually that is worth sharing, right, and creates value? So maybe that's then, it's empathy, it's emotional labor, it's healing, mental health services, peer-to-peer psychosocial counseling, or very much down the road, maybe it's our brain, right? It's neuro enhancement, and I mean, ultimately, and maybe we live in to be really science fiction, we're going to live in a world where we share memories, right? Where we have experiences that we trade, where we can even trade identities, right? Where we can be somebody else for a certain time, and we have a marketplace, a sharing economy of identities, of digital and identity. So that's really far out. But I think those are some ideas, right? So very concrete policy level, universal basic income. The organizational level, I think just embracing the best features of the sharing or the gig economy, incorporating that, cooperating with the gig economy platforms. And then I think thirdly, I think just having a very open conversation about our future selves and what will still make us human in 10, 20 years. And then drawing a line and saying, well, there are some things that we do not want to be part of any kind of economy and become monetized, commodified, right? These are sacred for us human beings. And then there are some elements,
like what would be an example of that, for example?
Well, I think what is sacred is probably, it's a good question. What is sacred is probably, I think it's probably, I think probably our most intimate relationships. I think whether that is family or friends, that is whenever there's something that cannot be quantified and that you do not want to be want to have commodified entered the marketplace. I think that's probably sacred. So everything we don't quite fully understand, and we feel like there is value in the mystery, and that's probably something that should remain sacred
and uncommercial and off
mm-hmm.
the platform.
Yeah.
Is there anything the platforms, because they're very powerful, as you alluded to, is there anything that the platforms themselves could do that would lower their anxiety or make the system more sustainable or more humanized? Or any thoughts on that? Maybe not, but I'm just curious. Any thoughts?
I think the best thing I recently read Mark Zuckerberg's commencement speech, and it made me cringe a little bit, hearing him, call for universal purpose. No doubt we're going to need a lot of purpose, and we need more intrinsic motivation and people who know that purpose in the future job market. But I just read it and I thought, well, that's his sort of question or his call for action is more purpose. But his answer is, of course, is Facebook. And if Facebook is, the platform to give us all purpose, then, I'm not sure that's sort of, a future I want to live in. Nothing against Facebook, is very valuable and I use it, but I think, and that's my answers here. I think the best thing they can do is just to always allow space for alternative ways of doing business, alternative ways of living. So if the digital platforms, and I believe, what is it, four of the six most valuable companies in the world are digital platforms right now. So there is they're incredibly powerful. They're modeling our behaviors, our values, right? They know us better to some degree than we know ourselves. They own our past, our present, our future. They can predict some of our actions, even our intentions. I mean, Google, and other digital platforms, they have tremendous power. So it's one thing to be responsible with that and to honor the trust that we've given them. But I think that honestly, the best thing they can do is, or that we have to do, is to make sure um, that there's always another space. And that's a very romantic idea as well. That there's not just that world. Not just the world that, Douglas Washkov describes sort of as the renaissance of feudal structures, right? There are some digital platforms being the digital overlords, the feudal lords, and then there's all the rest, right? No longer a middle class, and everybody else is just basically a data servant, if you will, right? And that's, I think, the danger. But as long as there's an alternative way of doing business, an alternative way of creating societies that is not just hinging on transactions and marketplaces, a social contract, I think that's something we need to insist on, that governments need to insist on and fight for. But I think hopefully that enlightened digital platforms also recognize as something crucial to their well-being and and thriving in the future, because otherwise I think they're going to lose the license to operate. And I think Uber and others are realizing, at least for the time being, they need it. They really need it to be successful.
So you're saying an alternative, meaning literally a kind of nonprofit or civic society versions of those platforms. So in other words, resist the urge to dominate or to reach every corner of the planet, and allow kind of friendly competition at some level from non-commercial entities. Is that the way it's
Yeah, I think so. The civic communities, or basically the freedom to have an identity still in 15 years, and not without being on Facebook, for example. Right? So the fact that you can have social currency and you have a reputation, you can enter relationships, interactions or transactions without having to invest in and nurture your online social profile, right? So I think we're probably close to a point where that might be the case. So I think as long as there's room for rebellion, for renegades, for the romantics to say, yes, that's all great, but we don't have to participate in the platform. We don't have to be on there. We don't have to. We're not dependent on income coming from the platform. There's another way of living. There's someone else maybe taking care of us, or there's another space, right, that we can thrive in. I think that is the beauty of being alive, right? That there is a pluralism, a multitude of concepts of how we want to live. And I think that worries me a little bit about the digital platforms, that they have become so powerful that they are just very much, I think, modeling to some extent, right, how future generations sort of live.
So do you think there's an enlightened self-interest from these platforms themselves, the leadership of the platforms? Because I'm interested in, sitting here in California too, and I know you used to live in California, but there's a point where there's a new system that's got to get born here. That's a new rebalancing between private and public sector, government and business, all this stuff. And it feels like the current system has kind of engorged certain players to the point where there's a backlash brewing, let's at least say at one level. So the question would be, is there something that, without being forced to by government or forced to by the civil society, is there something that these companies could actually do to kind of, I don't know, spread the wealth, or voluntarily, more magnanimously kind of, restructure their companies? Or I'm just kind of curious if you see any kind of, in this reinvention phase or this transition phase, any kind of really structural initiatives that could be done by the companies for their long-term actually health, honestly, and sustainability, but it
Mm.
still would not be your normal way business would operate. I'm just when
Very,
you go
very
ahead.
hard for them, right? It's very tricky because on the one hand, I think I applaud them for being active players, for example, in urban development, urban policy making, like take Airbnb or Uber. I mean, it's good that they have a seat at the table. They should have. On the one hand, whatever they will do in terms of policy proposals and influence will be scrutinized, right, as another way of sort of gaining economic advantage. So I think, it's sort of damn if you do, damn if you don't, right? So it's hard, but I think it's good that they do it. I think it's good that they engage. And frankly, I mean, the motivations maybe don't matter all that much, but as long as I think they're participating in these conversations and they help form future cities and future societies, right? That are that model some of the qualities that I described. So not just sort of serving their genuine self-interest as platforms. I mean, other than that, I think it's a lot of they could probably experiment with universal basic income, run experiments, redistribution of wealth, reskilling of workers. I mean, just using the platforms they have at their disposal and the sheer scale, right, in terms of employees and reach, to just help prototype and model some of those more forward-thinking ways of working. And I think to some degree they're already doing that. So I think that's good. And then thirdly, maybe it's a lot of it is just gesture. So a lot of people say, well, this is just a gesture, or this is just a symbolic act. But I wouldn't dismiss that. I think these rituals, these gestures are tremendously important. They create a persona and they create trust, even if they're just a gesture. So campaigns they run, things they say in response to events, or criticism they receive, how they behave in crisis, how human they are. I think all that matters. And I always feel like leaders and companies and brands, they gain a human persona when they do something that is surprising. Something surprising where people think, oh, really, they did that? They said they were wrong, or they apologized without like any sort of conditions, or they really were generous in their policy there. Or so I think I mean, look at Lyft and what happened to Uber and Lyft during the travel ban, right, and the JFK at the airport. And I think those moments is when I think the behavior gets magnified and is under a magnifying glass, right, and gets really scrutinized. And those moments, I think, really just creating essentially not just faking, right, cultures that are values driven, but creating cultures that are fundamentally ethical and values driven. And I think that's going to make a difference. And I think it's interesting that you take Uber, right? If you fail to do that at the very beginning of your trajectory as a startup, and the paradigm is always growth, right? And aggressive growth at any expense, then it's like a big ship, right? It's just so hard to course correct and then come in and say, now we're gonna, rectify and correct. And I think people see that. And that's the reason why Uber is struggling, particularly in Europe, with sort of, being banned in Denmark, mostly in France and in Germany, because they feel like they don't have the license to operate, because at the core, it's not a culture we trust. So I think that's what it all comes down to: creating a culture that is values driven and that is real, and then expressing that at the right occasion.
Well, as we kind of enter towards the end of this interview here, I just want to shift a little bit and build on what you just said there, but shift a little bit into, if I understand it right, you're both German and American citizen.
That's right. Yeah, dual
You've lived in
citizenship.
San Francisco, now you're in Berlin. Could you talk a little bit about the different perspectives on the sharing economy, or in general, maybe the tech world in general? I'm just, from your European lens, we see it pretty clearly from here. So, but I'm curious, since you knew this scene here, what struck you, or is anything struck you that of the differentiation, or anything impressed you as a better way to think about things, or for that matter, any divides that you think worry you or anything between the perspective in the center of Europe and here?
So it's hard for
And
me.
set aside Trump for now. Let's just set aside the Trump thing. I'm talking about the tech and the economy and kind of the
Yeah.
sharing economy world, for that matter.
It's oh God, I love talking about this, but it's so hard because whenever I'm in Europe, I just suddenly become very American and I defend everything that's American. I'm like, oh no, it's all great, and you guys. And whenever I'm in the US, I've become very European suddenly, and I feel very, defend European values. No, I mean I think I lived in the States for 14 years, and I'm married to a woman born and raised in San Francisco. So and um, it's so interesting that the Europeans want to be American, the Americans want to be European, right? It's just a great. But what I realized after 14 years is that the cultures, and especially the business cultures, no matter what you think, they're vastly different, vastly different. And I think a lot of American companies are really struggling with Europe, and they're really struggling, in particular, I think, with sort of the very context-rich cultures such as France and Germany in particular. I mean, look at Amazon, Google, Uber, Airbnb. They're all struggling with understanding Germany, and they're all hiring advisors who are basically just helping them understand the German psyche. So I'm not sure I can do that, but I think what is really, really different is I think that, well, it is a social market, society, a social market system, and I think that the emphasis really is on social, and the notion of solidarity and the government being a force that basically balances sort of uneven distribution of wealth to some degree, which might be called socialist very quickly in the US, more common and established there. And there is a very deep-seated skepticism, I think, versus companies that are purely driven by sort of profit motives that are very aggressive in their behavior. And I think there's a lot of concern over, platforms basically operating outside of regulatory, sort of regulated environments. And that's why I think some of the growth and the momentum and the entrepreneurship, that are so great about Silicon Valley, that maybe we Americans tend to glorify a little bit. They're also always viewed with a little bit of concern. It's like, well, at what expense? Like, what's the collateral damage of that, right? It can't just not be only about growth and market share. It needs to be balanced with a notion of solidarity and of a just, thriving society for everybody. And I think there's a lot. I think American firms can learn for that. In return, of course, I think European companies can learn is entrepreneurship, right? Creativity, and just like the pace and the optimism that are so beautiful about the valley. But all that said, right? I think especially in Berlin, as you might know, Berlin is really totally, I mean, it's a burgeoning startup scene, and there's a lot of food startups. There's a lot of sharing economy ideas and startups that are being invested in, not at the volume, of course, as is the case in the Valley, but I think stuff's happening, and it's very exciting right now.
So relatively recent returning there to Berlin, you mentioned the startup scene. But in the sharing economy space, could you just give us, as we're kind of closing up here, just a little insight of what you're seeing there in terms of the sharing economy? Any observations about what's happening over there?
I mean, there's a lot of food stuff happening. So, for example, I think there was a startup called Cooking with Chefs. I think that Peter Thiel even invested in. I'm not sure how they're doing, but I thought the idea was interesting. It's kind of like kitchen surfing, where you can basically, I think, host a dinner at home and invite chefs, and they cook for you, and you invite guests, and the platform facilitates between all parties. If I understand it correctly, there's also, I think, what is interesting, with the influx of refugees at massive scale, 800, 900,000, I think in Germany alone. There are some interesting models where there's a coding school from refugees for refugees, where refugees learn to code. There's a lot of there's one company, or it's a nonprofit, I should say, that is facilitating psychosocial counseling services between refugees. So refugees who basically help other refugees in terms of like addressing mental health issues and depression. So I think it's interesting to see the sharing economy and these models being used for the social good. I think that's one, kind of track that is very popular there, because I think it fits well with the current political situation, and also I think overall the psyche. So I think there's maybe one insight is that whenever you want to experiment, you want to try something new, something innovative, it's good to align that very closely with a social, a vetted, established social cause, because I think then you have the license to do that, more so than if it's a merely transactional venture or so. So that's what I'm observing. But I've only been there for a few months, so I'm an insider by any means.
But better than us. Okay. So just we kind of end up here looking a little more to the future. And one of the things I was struck by is when you're looking to the future, I mean, clearly there's a lot of jobs without succumbing to the kind of specter of AI and robotics too much. But there is clearly a lot of jobs, routine jobs, repetitive jobs, whether they're white collar or blue collar or service, are definitely going to be done by machines. I mean, it's seeming pretty clear about that. But then there's all these things that machines can't do, at least as of now, and there's all the complexity of human emotions and all the things interacting with people. So could you envision a time where the technology could be super efficient in connecting up inefficient human beings, but to actually consistently do what they love and do what they're great at, and connect them to other human beings? So, for example, one of the things that seems to be, a trouble here is the insecurity of these jobs. But what would stop, tools or technologies or AI for that matter to make sure there's just a constant stream of work, and you never really have to worry too much, because in a global economy, whatever your skill is going to be valued at this much, and blah, blah. Anyhow, you just keep doing what you love and connecting and living your life and lowering your anxiety. I mean, I'm just throwing that out as a scenario, but do you see this kind of working itself out in this kind of, we'll be the best and crazy most romantic humans we can be but in a hyper efficient way, that we don't have to kill ourselves trying to do it every day? Anyhow, just thoughts.
I think so. I mean, I think that's the utopian view, maybe, and that's the singularity.
Fair enough.
That's the Singularity University's selling card, right? I mean, they're saying, well, automation is going to liberate us to do what is truly meaningful for the world and for us, and to all live more purposeful lives. I'm simplifying their position a little bit. And that might very well be the case if we're smart, right? If we're smart, we automate those jobs that we never really wanted to do. But the question is, and that's predominantly, I think, process-driven, routine work, as you said. And there is a real possibility that we're going to be more artistic, that we're going to have more leisure time, that we're going to be able to pool our resources and our talent to tackle some of the world's pressing problems, such as climate change, right? Just sort of using our talent for what really matters, and have everything else done by machines. I mean, the question I have is just, I mean, first of all, I think that assumes some kind of a redistribution of wealth. It's an unsexier way of saying we need to share, the wealth or the productivity gains enabled by robots and automation. And that might be a robot tax, it might be universal basic income. I think that, again, that to me is like the foundation for it. And I think the other key challenge will be, well, if it is true that we'll have more time on our hands and we have more time to lead fulfilling lives and be our romantic selves, are we prepared for that? Or are we so used to defining ourselves through work and identities through the workplace that we're just going to stare into the abyss of not knowing what to do with our lives, and where is that purpose going to come from? And I think that's particularly true, not to sort of gender stereotype, but I think that one of the really pressing questions is, what are we going to do with men, right? How are we going to redesign the male identity outside of the workplace? How are we going to make sure that men have a role still to play in society if they're no longer the breadwinners, if they're no longer, defined so much by their work in the traditional environment? I think that's going to be a really interesting question. And I mean, it's a fascinating time. And whatever we do in the next 5 to 10 years, I think it's going to have profound implications for the next century, I guess. But I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic, and I think this human imagination has always eclipsed, I think, any kind of technology or efficiency thinking. In the end, I think we want to dream. We're social animals. We need intimacy, and I just don't see why we would want to engineer that out of our lives ultimately. I think those are very, very strong drivers.
Well, I hope you are right. And I also think it's a great place to end this, what has been a fascinating conversation with Tim. And I'll tell you what, awesome conversation, a lot of food for thought, ending on an optimistic note. And I want to thank Tim, you coming in from the other side of not quite the other side of the planet, but from European continent, and giving us a good amount of your time here to explain your big ideas. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Fun. Thank you.